The original perfect kill was thwarted when the target was obstructed. What Mike didn't expect was that his actions had been discovered by someone else. The other party left a note on Mike's car, warning him not to kill Hector. Exposed, Mike quickly drove away from the scene, stopping only after he had gone a considerable distance and confirmed it was safe. Mike concluded that his car had been bugged with a tracker, so he got out and meticulously searched, but he couldn't find anything after a long search. It seemed the device was very well hidden. Mike then went to a self-service auto repair shop, lifted the car, and continued his inspection, determined not to miss any suspicious spot. However, even after thoroughly checking the entire undercarriage, he still couldn't find the tracker. He lowered the car and prepared for a more exhaustive search, not even sparing the fuel cap. Despite his comprehensive efforts, he still couldn't locate the tracker, but Mike knew he had to find the tracker to identify the mysterious person tailing him. He decisively removed all the interior panels of the car to inspect every inch, but what made Mike feel utterly desperate was that even by the time the self-service auto repair shop owner announced it was closing time, he still hadn't found anything. To avoid being tracked any further, Mike decided to give the car to the shop owner. However, just as he was about to leave, he noticed the fuel caps sold in the shop, and he realized the tracker might be hidden there. Mike retrieved the discarded fuel cap, opened it, and sure enough, a tiny tracking device was inside. Mike took a taxi back to his place and removed the fuel cap of his own car. Upon opening it, he confirmed this car was also being tracked. He noted the model number of the tracker and then replaced it in the fuel cap. Mike planned to turn the tables and screwed the cap back on. His counter-tracking plan was just beginning when Mike started his night shift. He opened all the gate valves and removed the fuel cap, placing it near the guard booth to make it look like he hadn't left work. In the dead of night, Mike secretly met up with Caldera and gave him the model number of the tracker, asking him to get an identical one. With enough money, there's nothing Caldera can't do, and he quickly got Mike an identical tracker. After reading the manual, Mike discovered that the tracker would lose its signal once the battery was drained, so he removed the other party's tracker, installed his own, and screwed the fuel cap back on. Mike took out his frequently used radio to quickly drain the battery of the other tracker. As soon as the other party realized that the tracker's battery was too low, they would definitely come over and take it away to replace the battery. When the battery was almost drained, Mike removed it completely to kill the signal. Now, all Mike had to do was wait for the other party to take the bait. Mike waited nearly all night, and sure enough, someone came to retrieve the tracker from the fuel cap. Mike then grabbed his gun and began tailing their vehicle. Observing from the shadows, Mike saw the tracker handed off to another person. Mike also shifted the tracking target. Soon he came to a bridge and realized that he lost the car, but the signal showed that it was at this location. It turned out the other party had parked the car under the bridge. The man waited until no one was around, then retrieved a bag of money from beneath a manhole cover. It seems like this is the money for their deal. He continued this process at various locations, collecting bags of money until dawn, ultimately gathering a sizable haul. What Mike didn't know was that this would become his future job. Fans of Breaking Bad will recall how Mike once took Jesse to the countryside to collect money. Mike saw the man enter a store but leave shortly after. As the target moved away, Mike quickly turned around and followed. The camera panned to the sign of Los Palos Hermanos, hinting at Gus's upcoming appearance. In the last episode, Chuck pretended to resign and recorded Jimmy's crime of altering bank documents. Chuck then invited Howard over to prove he was framed by Jimmy. However, Howard disagreed with Chuck's approach. He believed Chuck should have informed him of the plan beforehand. As Chuck's sudden resignation had startled him, Howard argued that the tape alone was not enough to indict Jimmy, and Mesa Verde Bank's case would no longer be entrusted to HHM. In Howard's view, Chuck's actions were unnecessary, but it seemed Chuck had another plan in mind. When assistant Ernesto arrived, Chuck deliberately asked him to change the batteries in the recorder. As soon as the batteries were in, Jimmy's recording played out.
12:16. It was me.
Turn that off! Turn it off!
It all went
Turn it off!
exactly.
You did not hear that!
Chuck sternly warned Ernesto not to disclose this matter, or his career would be affected. After Ernesto left, Chuck showed a triumphant expression. It seemed Jimmy wouldn't be able to avoid falling into Chuck's trap again. He is the most charismatic villain in Breaking Bad. Even in death, he maintains a gentlemanly demeanor. Typically, when a villain dies, the audience feels a sense of satisfaction. However, Gus's death left many viewers feeling regretful, especially Mike, who was furious upon learning of Gus's death and vowed to settle the score with Walter. This shows how loyal Mike was to Gus. But how does Mike, who has always been a loner, Follow Gus? Better Call Saul provides detailed backstory. To find out who was tracking him, Mike discovered that the target had entered a fried chicken restaurant. In order not to blow his cover, Mike asks Jimmy to be his eyes and ears at Los Palos Hermanos. Jimmy ordered a meal and pretended to eat there. Soon, the target, carrying a bag, entered the restaurant. To get closer to Victor, Jimmy repeatedly changed his position. At this time, Gus made his entrance just as he did in Breaking Bad, appearing as a janitor cleaning the restaurant. This showcases Gus's low profile and caution, which is a key reason for his dominance. Jimmy stared intently at Victor, which did not go unnoticed by Gus, who was pretending to sweep nearby. After Gus walked past Victor, Victor turned and prepared to leave, throwing some trash into the bin on his way out. Jimmy's unwavering gaze on Victor made him appear somewhat unprofessional as a private investigator. Victor left after the dedication of Jimmy also came to the bin to look for just Victor threw away things trying to help Mike find useful clues. But before Jimmy could find anything, Gus caught him.
Can I help you?
Quick-witted, Jimmy quickly removed his watch and tossed it into the trash, then claimed he was looking for his lost watch. At this moment, Gus appears very approachable, giving no indication that he's actually a ruthless person. He even helped Jimmy find his lost watch. Jimmy then reported what he had seen to Mike, who was waiting outside. Mike was somewhat surprised to learn that Victor had gone in just to have breakfast. Jimmy wanted to continue helping Mike, but Mike dismissed him. As he left, Jimmy didn't forget to pitch his services again.
Who's got your back, huh? Me. That's who.
I'll keep that in mind.
As Jimmy was leaving, Gus followed him outside. From Gus's serious expression, it was clear he had realized Mike was looking for him, so Gus decided to take the initiative. He instructed his subordinate, Victor, to carry the tracker to deliberately mislead Mike. Mike followed the signal all the way to a desolate area. The tracker was just ahead, but there were no vehicles in sight. Using binoculars, Mike realized he had been tricked. The tracker was placed on top of a cell phone.
Yeah.
May I assume that you are armed?
Yes.
I do not wish to see your gun. And if I don't, I promise you won't see mine. Are we in agreement?
We are.
Expect 2 cars momentarily.
And that's how Gus had his first meeting with Mike in relative safety. Mike pulled out the note he found when he tried to assassinate Hector and demanded to know why Gus was tracking him. Gus, without beating around the bush, explained that Hector's death would not benefit him at the moment. He is well aware of the conflict between Mike and Hector, including Mike's robbery of Hector's money and Hector's murder of an innocent witness. All of this was under Gus's surveillance. Gus stated that Mike could continue robbing Hector's trucks but could not kill Hector. In return, Gus would stop tracking Mike. Just as Gus was about to leave, Mike called out to him. From Gus's permission to rob Hector's cargo, Mike realized they were competitors. Given that he still had unfinished business with Hector, the enemy of his enemy was his friend. This marked the first collaboration between Mike and Gus. Meanwhile, Ernesto, knowing Chuck had evidence against Jimmy, was too scared to tell Jimmy directly and instead informed Kim first. Upon hearing the news, Kim immediately called Jimmy over and had him pay her $1 to establish attorney-client privilege. Realizing that Chuck had secretly recorded their conversation, Jimmy understood he had fallen into Chuck's trap. Rational Kim knew that a single recording couldn't prove everything, but they needed to figure out Chuck's purpose for making it. After attending to all the clients, Jimmy still felt gloomy. After several hours of consultation and analysis, Kim guessed that Chuck wouldn't show the recording to Mesa Verde's Kevin, and Howard wouldn't agree to Chuck revealing it either, as it would damage the firm's reputation. But Kim couldn't figure out Chuck's real motive for the recording. She advised Jimmy to stay put and patiently wait for Chuck to make his move. After Kim left, Jimmy, following his brother's method of removing tape, grew angrier the more he thought about it. Just a few days earlier, he had confessed to his brother about altering the bank documents. Thinking it would make Chuck forgive him, he even helped Chuck remove the space blanket from the wall. Chuck, seeing Jimmy's rough removal method that could damage the furniture's finish, taught him the proper way. Jimmy also noticed that Chuck still kept the books he loved as a child, and they reminisced about happy memories from the past. In that moment, Jimmy felt like he had his brother's approval. What he couldn't accept was that Chuck had gone to such great lengths to deceive him, and had even recorded it. In a fit of anger, Jimmy tore off the tape, ready to confront Chuck. Meanwhile, Howard also secretly visited Chuck's house because Chuck had hired a private investigator for 8 days, waiting for Jimmy to take the bait, a costly expense that Howard doesn't see the need to incur. Chuck, hypocritically cloaking his personal vendetta as legal strategy, defended his actions. Howard suggested that Chuck broaden his perspective and take a step back for the bigger picture. After all, Howard was the majority shareholder of HHM, so Chuck compromised. Chuck said he would hire the private investigator only at night because he was convinced Jimmy would sneak in to steal the tape then. This shows that Jimmy's image in Chuck's mind is so bad. Hearing this, Howard is very helpless, and he asks Chuck why he is so sure. Chuck's answer was still that he knew his brother well. However, the reality proved him wrong quickly. Instead of sneaking in at night, Jimmy came straight to confront Chuck in broad daylight.
Jimmy!
You take me?
Jimmy!
You pulled that heartstrings con job on me? Oh, my brain used to work. I'm sick. I don't know what to do. No wonder Rebecca left you. What took her so long? There it is.
In his furious state, Jimmy didn't realize that Chuck had hidden 2 witnesses in the house. Once again, he fell into Chuck's carefully laid trap.
Happy now for what? For nothing! Is that all there is, Chuck? That's all there is? How'd you make copies, huh, Chuck? Huh? You tell me or I'll burn this house to the ground!
Jimmy! That's enough! You need to step away.
Howard, you were a witness to what happened here?
I was.
To get his own brother imprisoned, Chuck first pretended to be pitiful to gain his brother's sympathy. He guessed his brother would confess to some crimes, so he secretly recorded their conversation, then intentionally leaked the recording. When Jimmy found out he had been tricked, he burst in furiously, falling right into Chuck's trap again. After finding the tape, Jimmy destroyed it right in front of Chuck, unaware that this was all part of Chuck's plan, and as a witness to the private detective has been waiting for a long time. By the time Jimmy realized what was happening, it was too late. His emotions were just a weak point for Chuck to exploit. Jimmy called his new assistant to cancel his appointments for the next few days, then quietly sat by the roadside, waiting for the police. Hypocritical Chuck even invited Jimmy inside to wait and made excuses for his disgraceful actions. Although Chuck claimed he was doing it for Jimmy's own good, he was always considering his own perspective.
But Jimmy, this is an opportunity. That's why I'm doing this, not to punish you, to show you, truly show you that you have to make a change before it's too late, before you destroy yourself or someone else. And I believe you can change. You'll find your path. And when you're ready, I will be there to help you walk that path.
Just like Walter in Breaking Bad, he claims to be doing it for the good of his family, but in the end, he realizes how much disaster his actions have caused them. This sharply satirizes many people in real life. If you truly care for someone, you should consider their needs from their perspective, rather than trying to shape them into what you want them to be. What Jimmy really wanted was his brother's recognition and help, which is not too much to ask. But Chuck never accepted Jimmy, instead always focusing on his flaws. If Chuck really wants what's best for Jimmy, then accept him and support him, and then restrain Jimmy's behavior as a big brother. Then they'll surely become good brothers in Jimmy's heart who reigns supreme in the legal world. However, with that one misguided thought, Chuck sent Jimmy to prison for reform. This doomed them both to mutual destruction. At the police station, Jimmy encountered the sneering prosecutor Bill. Seeing Jimmy in such a state, Bill seemed to regain his sense of superiority. The next day in court, the judge was surprised to see lawyer Jimmy appearing in this manner. Based on Jimmy's multiple offenses, he faced up to 2.5 years in prison and a $6,000 fine. The judge reminded Jimmy he could plead not guilty and asked if he had a defense attorney. Kim, having heard the news, arrived just in time as Jimmy's lawyer, but Jimmy expressed his desire to represent himself. Although the judge did not recommend self-representation, she respected the defendant's wishes. Reluctantly, Kim was asked to leave by the judge because Jimmy recently started working in elder law. The judge considered his work an indispensable part of the legal field. Weighing this, she set his bail at $2,500. After returning, Jimmy explained everything to Kim, recounting the events of the previous day in detail. He admitted that he had fallen into Chuck's trap. Jimmy knew Kim was already overwhelmed with the Mesa Verde case and didn't want her to be affected by his mess. He'll take care of this himself. Meanwhile, on his first collaboration with Gus, Mike arrived at a clinic near the Mexican border. This clinic, funded by Gus, provided free medical care to civilians. Dr. Barry, of course, followed Gus's orders. In Breaking Bad, after Gus's revenge in Mexico left him severely poisoned, it was this doctor who provided emergency care, saving both the poisoned Gus and the gunshot-wounded Mike. Gus arranged for Barry to give Mike a bag of contraband. Mike then began sabotaging Hector's transport routes. He drove to a key location along Hector's transportation route, took out a new pair of shoes, and filled them with the contraband he got from Barry. After several attempts, Mike managed to hang the shoes securely on a power line. When Hector's truck passed by, Mike was already waiting in a concealed spot. Since they are checked every time they cross the border, they stop to hide the guns they are carrying every time they get to this location. Mike fired a shot into the air. Hearing the gunshots, the two men quickly hit the ground. Mike fired several more shots, making them think it was just hunters, so they relaxed their guard. They hid their guns and prepared to leave. As their truck passed under the shoes, Mike fired another shot, hitting the shoes and scattering the contraband onto the truck. When they reached the border checkpoint, they were unaware of the trouble looming. The sniffer dog detected the contraband, sat down, and the two men were arrested on the spot. As a result, Hector's ice cream shop was also shut down. Seeing Hector's business disrupted, Mike felt a sense of relief. Meanwhile, due to Chuck's health issues, District Attorney Kyra had to visit Chuck at home to discuss the case against Jimmy. The prosecutor assumed Jimmy had assaulted Chuck. Chuck admitted that although Jimmy had many flaws, he had a moral baseline and wouldn't physically harm his brother. The prosecutor worried Chuck might not testify against Jimmy in court, but Chuck assured her he would. Kyra stated that Jimmy wouldn't receive leniency just because he was a lawyer. Chuck agreed with Kyra's stance. However, Chuck was conflicted. As Jimmy was still his brother, he wondered if there was a better solution. That evening, Jimmy went to the office and, rarely smoking, lit an expired cigarette. He only smoked when deeply troubled. Kim noticed that Jimmy was preoccupied. She learned that Jimmy had received a plea deal from Kyra. The plea deal was in the form of a pretrial diversion, which surprised Jimmy. Pretrial diversion meant admitting guilt without prosecution or a criminal record. Kim thought this was a good outcome for Jimmy and that it would drive Chuck mad. But Jimmy revealed it was Chuck's idea. This was the compromise Chuck had proposed to Kyra. However, before accepting this deal, they needed to submit the felony confession to the Bar Association, meaning Jimmy would lose his law license. Jimmy realized that Chuck didn't want him in jail but wanted him disbarred. Jimmy had considered this possibility before breaking into his brother's house, but he hadn't anticipated the consequences to be so severe. Moreover, Chuck was very familiar with the people at the Bar Association, leaving Jimmy in an isolated and helpless state. Kim couldn't stand by and watch Jimmy fight alone. She insisted on helping with his defense, calling Jimmy's predicament a sunk cost. Jimmy accepted Kim's help and decided to turn the tables, vowing to give Chuck a taste of his own medicine. This is a psychological shadow that has haunted Gus his entire life. To collaborate with the Mexican criminal organization, Gus unintentionally offended them, resulting in his partner Max being killed on the spot. From that moment, a seed of hatred took root in Gus's heart. To avenge Max's tragic death, Gus endured hardship, pretending to work for the cartel. Years later, Gus, with his outstanding sales skills, had surpassed Hector's gang. Even when delivering money to Don, he packaged it meticulously. In contrast to Hector's disorganized bundles of cash, Don clearly preferred Gus's method of tribute. Tang ordered Hector to follow Gus's rules and even put on the t-shirt Gus had given him. Proud Hector couldn't swallow this humiliation, especially with his recent transport routes being disrupted. Thus, Hector came to the chicken restaurant looking for trouble. Hector demanded the manager call the boss, but the manager said the boss wasn't there. Since he was there, Hector wouldn't leave easily. He declared he could wait and ignored the no smoking sign. Arrogantly puffing on a cigar, customers immediately sensed the danger, and some parents with children tried to leave but were blocked by Arturo. Seeing this, Nacho quickly signaled to Arturo, who then allowed the customers to leave. This highlights Nacho's character. Although forced to work for a criminal organization, he has a kind heart. Despite the manager's pleas, Hector forced his way into Gus's office to wait. At that moment, Gus was at the fire station recruiting talent. Upon receiving an urgent call from his employee, he rushed to the chicken restaurant. Seeing his employees threatened, Gus immediately gave them paid leave for the day.
We are closed for today.
Apart from being a cartel member, Gus was undoubtedly a good boss. After the employees left, Gus headed straight to the office to confront Hector, using the cartel's interests to protect himself. But Hector, claiming to represent the cartel, forcibly demanded Gus assist with shipments and used Gus's pen to scrape dirt from his shoe onto the desk. No matter how arrogant Hector was, Gus tolerated him without direct confrontation. Only after achieving his goal did Hector leave. However, Hector was unaware that Gus, in secret collaboration with Mike, was behind the disruption of his transport routes. While Hector appeared to have succeeded, Gus was the true victor. As promised, Gus had his men fulfill their agreement with Mike, who refused the thousands of dollars in payment. Feeling this action was for himself, Mike's style of doing things also set the stage for Gus to seek his help again in the future. The next day at work, Gus gathered his employees together to dispel the fear Hector and his men had instilled in them the day before. Gus concocted a benevolent lie on the spot, and with an inspiring speech, he quickly restored the employees to their normal working state. Meanwhile, to help Jimmy deal with Chuck, Kim made numerous calls to repair companies. Since Jimmy had kicked down Chuck's door earlier, Kim deduced that Chuck would schedule a door repair service. Finally, Kim found the company Chuck had scheduled with and extracted the appointment time, then canceled the service under a pretext. Gene handed the information to Jimmy and was worried about the person he had chosen. Jimmy reassured Kim, saying that the person he found was the best of the best. That person was none other than Mike, who had collaborated with Jimmy multiple times. Chuck, without suspicion, invited Mike into his home and explained his needs. Mike first pretended to ask where the power source was. Chuck explained that there was no electricity, and that he had asked his assistant to make that clear when he made the appointment. Then Mike took out an electric wrench.
I'm sorry. I understood there would be no power tools of any kind.
What, a screwdriver and a hammer? Turns a morning job into 2 days with me, myself, and Ben Gay. But it's your call.
I suppose. Very well.
The shrill sound of the electric tool made Chuck anxious, which was precisely Jimmy's plan, to make himself more comfortable. Chuck retreated upstairs, giving Mike the opportunity to take covert photos. These photos were essential to Jimmy's plan. Mike handed the completed photos to Jimmy, who praised Mike profusely. Then Jimmy asked Mike for a note containing Chuck's ex-wife Rebecca's contact information. Rebecca was a crucial part of Jimmy's strategy against Chuck, setting the stage for the next episode where Jimmy invites Rebecca. Jimmy also asked Mike for his impression of Chuck, hoping to hear that Chuck was a jerk, but Mike's tasks never involved personal judgments. Seeing Mike remain silent, Jimmy didn't press further and instead confirmed how well the door repair was done. Mike assured Jimmy that Chuck wouldn't complain, since Jimmy hadn't charged Mike for acting as a lookout at the chicken restaurant. They were even. That evening, Gus went to Mike's workplace to have a talk. Questioning why Mike hadn't accepted the agreed-upon payment, Mike candidly said he sabotaged Hector's business for his own reasons, not for Gus. Gus understood that Mike sought revenge for innocent civilians, making him feel better. Gus, having guessed most of Mike's motives, received no denial from Mike. Gus admitted learning a lot from Mike and suggested that Mike consider working for him in the near future. After a moment's thought, Mike agreed but stipulated it would depend on the specifics of the work. Just as Gus was about to leave, he revealed the true reason he stopped Mike from killing Hector.
I stopped you from killing Hector.
Like you said, it wasn't in your interest.
A bullet to the head would have been far too humane.
This echoes the beginning where Max is brutally murdered by Hector. No one but Gus could take Hector's head, laying the groundwork for Gus's eventual fate. The next day, Jimmy and Chuck arrived at Kyra's office for the pretrial transfer. Before beginning, Kyra chatted casually with Chuck and Howard, indicating their familiarity with her. Clearly, Jimmy and Kim were at a disadvantage. Kyra outlined the situation Jimmy would face, including his confession being submitted to the New Mexico Bar Association. All of this was within Jimmy's expectations. During the meeting, the parties disputed a particular testimony. After reaching an agreement, just when Jimmy thought it was over, Kyra insisted that Jimmy apologize to Chuck in person. Reluctantly, knowing he was at fault, Jimmy complied.
I'm very sorry. I lost my temper and I did some things, so many things that I regret. I shouldn't have broken down your door. Doesn't matter how I was provoked. I shouldn't have done that. There's no excuse for that or for the things that I said. I regret it all All of it, more than you can imagine. Because you're my brother. And no one should treat his own brother like that. Not ever.
Though on the surface he was apologizing, he was actually mocking Chuck's behavior. Finally, Kyra demanded that Jimmy compensate Chuck for the damages, totaling $321. Unexpectedly, Chuck added $2.98 for the damaged tape recorder. Kyra agreed to Chuck's request. Chuck relished the feeling of victory. After the meeting, Jimmy stormed out, pretending to be furious. He didn't bother saying goodbye to Chuck. Kim then reminded Chuck and Howard that she would file a motion to suppress the tape recording at the hearing. Howard responded that the tape had already been destroyed by Jimmy, but Kim was prepared. She revealed that the destroyed tape was a copy. She explained that Chuck knew Jimmy would come for him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have hired a private investigator as a witness. Therefore, Chuck must have hidden the original tape. Howard was about to continue arguing, but Chuck stopped him. Chuck directly admitted that the destroyed tape was indeed a copy and stated that the original would be played when necessary. With that, he left with Howard. What Chuck and Howard didn't realize was that this was a test by Kim. When Kim exited the elevator, Jimmy, who had been waiting, quickly asked her for information.
Bingo.
It seemed they were confident in their plan. This is the most thrilling episode of Better Call Saul Season 3, where the protagonist Jimmy faces off against his brother Chuck in court. Will the cunning Chuck outmaneuver the silver-tongued Jimmy, or will Jimmy prevail? Stay tuned to find out. Faced with Chuck's accusations, Jimmy and Kim have already set their plan in motion. Working seamlessly together, they not only gathered crucial evidence but also tested Chuck's next moves. Through Mike's introduction, Jimmy brought a goldfish to meet Caldera, only to get scolded. Caldera cared more about the animals than people. Jimmy's purpose was to get Caldera to introduce him to a highly professional pickpocket, an essential part of his plan against Chuck. After confirming that Jimmy wouldn't confine the person he introduced like a goldfish, Caldera agreed to Jimmy's request. Meanwhile, Kim proactively approached Kevin, the president of Mesa Verde Bank, and confessed about Chuck's accusation that Jimmy tampered with the bank's address. She wanted the client to hear the news from her first. To appear more honest, since Kim had won the case for Mesa Verde Bank, Kevin admired her abilities. Kevin didn't care about Chuck's accusations against Jimmy and was happy to invite Kim to dinner. Chuck, on the other hand, wasn't idle. The day before the hearing, he sneaked into the courtroom to ensure he wouldn't be disturbed by strong electromagnetic radiation. However, Howard had concerns. After sending the staff away, he privately discussed the matter with Chuck. Howard worried about Chuck's health and suggested he shouldn't testify in person. With solid evidence, Howard's presence alone would suffice. Chuck, shrewd as always, saw through Howard's real concern. It wasn't about his health but about the reputation of HHM if he screwed up. Howard didn't deny it, citing the loss of the Mesa Verde case as the best example, but Chuck was not listening. He needed to see Jimmy disbarred with his own eyes to feel at ease. The firm's interests were not on Chuck's mind. The next day, in court, Chuck's attorney, Allie, presented a series of charges against Jimmy, requesting the Bar Association revoke Jimmy's license. When it was Kim's turn, she first acknowledged Jimmy's crimes and expressed his deep regret. Then, Kim revealed the reasons behind the incidents, arguing that if the full context were understood, the association would see Jimmy as an indispensable member of the legal community. Howard, as a witness, detailed the events as they happened. Through her questioning, Kim successfully got Howard to admit that Chuck prevented HHM from hiring Jimmy to avoid nepotism. Even though Jimmy worked diligently and earned Howard's recognition, it was to no avail. Hearing this, Allie accused Kim of going off topic, but Kim argued it was crucial for understanding the brothers' relationship. The judge, considering the situation, allowed Kim to continue but reminded her to stay on topic, as the hearing was about Jimmy, not Chuck. Kim then continued questioning Howard, confirming that it was Jimmy who took care of Chuck during his illness. Even when Jimmy was extremely busy, Howard didn't deny this. Kim continued to ask Howard if he was aware of Chuck's psychological condition. Before Howard could answer, Allie immediately objected, claiming that Chuck's mental health was not relevant to the discussion. This time, the judge halted Kim and dismissed Howard from the stand. Jimmy realized that his key witness had not yet arrived. Seeing his assistant Francesca shake her head slightly, Jimmy knew something had gone wrong. Allie requested to play the recording in court. Although Kim knew she couldn't prevent it, she still had to formally object. As the recording was about to be played, Jimmy asked Francesca why the witness hadn't arrived yet. Francesca explained that the flight had been delayed by 40 minutes. Jimmy then deliberately looked for excuses to stall for time. Meanwhile, Chuck was at home rehearsing the statement he planned to make in court. He tried various statements, but none of them felt satisfactory, indicating how seriously he took this hearing. At that moment, Howard personally arrived to pick up Chuck. As he left, Chuck muttered something under his breath.
The law is too important.
And the hearing has already begun to play the recording.
You'd go to such lengths to humiliate me? I did it for Kim! She worked her butt off to get Mesa Verde while you and Howard sat around sipping scotch and chortling. Hamlin, McGill, more like Scrooge and Marley. Kim deserves Mesa Verde, not you, not HHM. She earned it and she needs it. I did it to help her, but I honestly didn't think it would hurt you so bad. I thought you'd just say, I made a mistake and go on with your life like a normal person, but oh no, wishful thinking. So can I, tell Howard you're not quitting or retiring or whatever? Can we take all this down off the walls? I'm gonna go call Howard.
Jimmy, you do realize you just confessed to a felony?
Yes. But you feel better, right? Besides, it's your word against mine.
After hearing the recording, everyone could understand Jimmy's actions. While his methods weren't commendable, the story behind them was quite touching at least. Kim was moved by Jimmy's actions. Next, in anticipation of Chuck's court appearance, everyone cooperated by temporarily turning in their mobile phones and other electronic devices. Jimmy, however, lied that he had left his phone in the car and didn't turn it in, setting the stage for later events. Then the staff turned off all the lights in the room, even covering the clock on the wall. Notably, the time now read 12:16, the exact numbers Jimmy had altered in Mesa Verde Bank's address. Meanwhile, Howard had brought Chuck downstairs. As Chuck ascended the stairs, he accidentally bumped into a man. What Chuck didn't know was that this man was part of Jimmy's master plan. This man would later become Saul's bodyguard in Breaking Bad. At the hearing, the judge asked Chuck what the motivation behind the recording was. Chuck explained that he suspected Jimmy of altering the address in a case he was handling, which caused him to lose a client. Jimmy did this to help his girlfriend Kim, resulting in the client choosing Kim instead. Kim objected to this. Chuck quickly clarified that he wasn't accusing Kim of being an accomplice. He was merely stating the outcome. Allie asked if Chuck had any evidence to support his suspicion of Jimmy. Chuck admitted he had no evidence because Jimmy was too cunning, perfectly covering his tracks. Kim immediately objected, arguing that without evidence, Chuck couldn't prove Jimmy's guilt. The judge allowed Chuck to finish his statement and told Kim she could cross-examine him directly if she had any questions. Chuck revealed his plan, stating that the recording was only the first step. He acknowledged that a single recording wasn't enough to convict Jimmy. He guessed that Jimmy would care about this recording. Jimmy breaking into his house and destroying the recording was the best proof. Kim immediately countered that this was all Chuck's subjective speculation. How could he know what Jimmy was thinking? The judge sustained the objection and instructed Chuck to only describe the events in detail. The judge noted that Chuck seemed somewhat mentally disturbed in the recording. Chuck explained that he was pretending and deliberately exaggerating his condition to uncover the truth. The judge asked Chuck to describe his condition so everyone could better understand the case. Chuck confessed that he had electromagnetic hypersensitivity, but this was Chuck's own claim. No professional doctor had diagnosed him. Chuck argued that many diseases were initially undiagnosed. Given the rarity of his symptoms, it would take time to explain. He insisted that the condition did not affect his mental judgment, only causing physical pain. Allie asked Chuck one final question: did he hate his brother Jimmy? Chuck replied that he loved his brother. Jimmy wasn't inherently bad, but he often did terrible things for supposedly noble reasons. However, to Chuck, the law was sacred and inviolable. Chuck stated he didn't want to hurt Jimmy but wanted to protect what he respected. His words were ironic. From Jimmy's perspective, they applied equally well to Chuck. Jimmy appeared more genuine. He believed Chuck had wronged Kim by taking her client, so he used his skills to win the case back for her. But Chuck came across as hypocritical. He claimed the sanctity of the law to satisfy his selfish desires. Chuck couldn't stand the idea of Jimmy succeeding in the legal field more than him. Noticing that a key person hadn't arrived yet, Jimmy had Kim request a recess to buy some time. Shortly after, Chuck's ex-wife Rebecca arrived at the hearing. Much to Chuck's surprise, the last time he'd seen Rebecca was a few years ago. At that time, Jimmy suggested that Chuck confess his illness to Rebecca, but Chuck didn't take Jimmy's advice. He didn't want Rebecca to know about his bizarre illness. During a dinner with Rebecca, she unexpectedly received a call from her boss, causing extreme discomfort for electromagnetically sensitive Chuck. Due to the length of Rebecca's phone call, Chuck could no longer bear it. He eventually grabbed Rebecca's phone and threw it away, scolding her for being extremely rude. Rebecca couldn't understand Chuck's behavior. The carefully prepared candlelight dinner ended prematurely. As Rebecca was about to leave, Jimmy urged Chuck to confess his condition, believing Rebecca would understand, but Chuck remained adamant, and so Rebecca was kept in the dark. To prevent his law license from being revoked, Jimmy revealed Chuck's condition to Rebecca. As a result, Rebecca traveled a long way to see Chuck. Seeing Rebecca left Chuck flustered, and he requested a break from the judge. He assumed Jimmy had summoned Rebecca as a witness, but Rebecca said she was there out of concern for Chuck's health, scolding him for not telling her sooner. Chuck explained that he didn't want Rebecca to worry. In reality, he feared she would look down on him. Seeing Chuck's displeasure, Rebecca decided to leave the hearing to avoid distracting him, but Chuck insisted that Rebecca stay. Wanting her to see Jimmy's true nature, Kim reminded Jimmy that Rebecca would hate him after this was over, but Jimmy no longer cared. The brothers then entered battle mode. Jimmy knew that Chuck's supposed electromagnetic hypersensitivity was actually a psychological condition. When Chuck was arrested by the police for buying the neighbor's newspaper, he was sent to the hospital because of his overreaction. The doctors secretly turned on electrical devices, but Chuck felt nothing. Jimmy and Kim had noticed this. If Jimmy could disprove Chuck's ability to sense electromagnetic radiation, his lie would collapse. So, Jimmy began to steer the questioning in that direction. He asked Chuck what he felt when he touched the tape recorder. If Chuck couldn't withstand the electromagnetic radiation, how did he manage to record secretly? Chuck said that he did feel uncomfortable, but the short duration of radiation from the tape recorder was within his tolerance, and he had hidden the tape recorder under a radiation-proof space blanket. Jimmy asked Chuck to describe what the home environment was like at the time of the recording. Chuck answered honestly, saying he covered the room with space blankets. Jimmy suggested this was part of Chuck's elaborate trap. Chuck countered that it was just a way for him to exaggerate his condition in order to get Jimmy to tell the truth. Jimmy asked how Chuck knew this tactic would ensnare him, but these were subjective speculations, and the opposing lawyer objected. Jimmy began using evidence to counter Chuck. He implied Chuck's actions were erratic and hinted at a mental illness. Chuck maintained his initial stance, saying he exaggerated his condition and that his house was normal. Jimmy takes out the photos that Mike helped him take, and sees the exposed wires and petrol lamps, which no one in their right mind would live like this. Chuck claimed these were precautions against the pain electromagnetic radiation caused him. Jimmy argued that without a doctor's diagnosis, Chuck's self-diagnosed condition couldn't be proven. Allie continued to object, stating this was not valid evidence and that the jury had already ruled Chuck's mental health was not under scrutiny. But Jimmy countered, saying that since Chuck claimed he exaggerated his condition, he had the right to question further. To understand his perspective, they needed to see things from his viewpoint regarding Chuck. Jimmy believed Chuck hated him and had tricked him into confessing, while he deceived Chuck to make him feel better. Understanding who to believe required comprehending Chuck's mindset. The judge found some merit in Jimmy's argument and allowed him to continue questioning. Jimmy pointed out that Chuck's symptoms appeared shortly after his divorce, asking if the stress from the divorce caused them. Chuck denied this, stating he had a good relationship with his ex-wife despite their divorce. Jimmy wanted Chuck to recall their last meeting, during which Chuck hid his condition from Rebecca at dinner, but Allie objected, saying this wasn't family court and questioned the relevance of Jimmy's inquiries. Smarty Pants Chuck says he knows why Jimmy invited Rebecca to court.
He knows I still have a lot of feeling for my ex-wife. He's hoping this will break me down. Split me apart at the seams like a murderer confessing on an episode of Perry Mason. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, Jimmy. Have I answered your questions to your satisfaction?
The look in Chuck's eyes showed how pleased he was, believing Jimmy was about to lose his law license, fulfilling Chuck's long-held desire. However, Chuck's current satisfaction would soon turn to misery. Jimmy played his final card, asking Chuck to describe the detailed symptoms of his electromagnetic hypersensitivity. Jimmy then gives Francesca a wink and tells her to go out and bring in the witness Huel. Chuck thanked the court for removing all electronic devices, making him feel no electromagnetic interference, but Jimmy questioned why Chuck couldn't feel the emergency exit lights, which couldn't be turned off. Chuck explained that those lights didn't carry much current and were far from him. According to the inverse square law, the intensity weakened with distance. Chuck's explanation was thorough, but he was unknowingly walking into Jimmy's trap. Jimmy asked, since distant things couldn't be felt, could he feel something close by? Chuck replied in the affirmative. He seemed to see Jimmy's little trick and said there was something in Jimmy's pocket. Jimmy admitted he hadn't surrendered his phone. The judge scolded Jimmy for not following the special requirements, but Chuck wasn't alarmed. He was confident and picked up the phone to check.
Just as I thought. There's no battery in here. You removed the battery.
Could you reach into your breast pocket and tell me what's there?
What now?
To Chuck's shock, he found a battery in his pocket. Jimmy called his witness, Huel, to the stand. Jimmy said the battery had been in Chuck's pocket for an hour and a half and was fully charged. Jimmy then placed the battery in a phone to demonstrate. Exposing Chuck's lie, Allie panicked and admitted that Chuck's mental illness wasn't the issue. Hearing this, Chuck lost his composure.
If he were schizophrenic, it wouldn't take away from the fact that the defendant...
am not crazy!
This is the best part of Chuck's performance. He said all his resentment towards Jimmy in one breath.
Jimmy! He through a sunroof! And I saved him! And I shouldn't have. I took him into my own firm! What was I thinking? He'll never change. He'll never change. Ever since he was 9, always the same. Couldn't keep his hands out of the cash drawer. But not our Jimmy. Couldn't be precious Jimmy. Stealing them blind. And he gets to be a lawyer? What a sick joke. I should have stopped him when I had the chance. And you have to stop him.
By the time Chuck realized it, it was too late. Rebecca and Howard looked down in disappointment. This outcome had been anticipated by Kim and Jimmy. Chuck, thinking he'd come out as the victor, instead faced a spectacular downfall. Finally, Chuck glanced at the emergency exit sign. At that moment, he probably wished he could escape as quickly as possible. This is the most explosive performance by Chuck in the classic American TV show Better Call Saul, and simultaneously the most embarrassing moment of his life. Because Chuck couldn't control his emotions, he blurted out years of pent-up grievances against his brother in court. By the time he realized it, he wished he could find a hole to crawl into. Even more embarrassing was that the thing Chuck least wanted Rebecca to know was ultimately exposed. He hit it home, sinking into depression, and refused to open the door even when Rebecca came knocking. Meanwhile, Jimmy's painstaking efforts paid off with the best possible outcome. His law license was not revoked but only suspended for a year. During this year, he is barred from engaging in any legal work. If he causes any more trouble, his law license will be permanently revoked. Jimmy and Kim celebrated at their WM law firm. At that moment, someone suddenly knocked on the door. It was Rebecca seeking Jimmy's help. Rebecca was very worried about Chuck, who had shut himself off from the world, and she wanted Jimmy to visit Chuck and persuade him to come out. However, Jimmy, having seen through Chuck, declared that he had severed ties with his brother. Hearing this, Rebecca angrily retorted that Chuck's illness was understandable, but what was Jimmy's excuse? After saying that, Rebecca turned and left. Jimmy's refusal officially marked the end of his relationship with Chuck. That evening, Howard brought a bottle of fine wine to visit Chuck, but Chuck, still distressed, didn't want to see anyone. Howard stated that if Chuck didn't open the door, he would sit outside and wait. Reluctantly, Chuck finally opened the door. The bottle was a valuable 1966 wine, a treasured piece from Howard's personal collection. Now, the only person who could help Chuck was Howard. Howard informed Chuck of Jimmy's judgment, saying that a 1-year suspension was also a kind of victory. Moreover, given Jimmy's character, he was likely to violate the Bar Association's rules again within the year, which would lead to his permanent disbarment. But Chuck remained sullen. Howard advised Chuck that Jimmy wasn't worth all this trouble and suggested that Chuck move on and focus on the future. Continuing like this would be a waste of his time and talent. Chuck also realized that if he didn't get his act together, he was really done for.
To new beginnings. To new beginnings.
Howard drove off after the drinks. After Howard left, Chuck downed the remaining wine in his glass. Then he took out a recorder from a drawer and removed the batteries, bravely challenging his fear of electromagnetic fields. Meanwhile, because of his suspension, Jimmy began calling his clients one by one to explain the situation. With Jimmy's efficiency, it took him only a short while to reach the last client on his list. Coincidentally, this client was a retired veteran, because previously, When Jimmy shot an ad, he had used a military bomber as a background for free. After the matter was exposed, he was held accountable. This reminded Jimmy that his ads on the TV station also needed to be suspended, so he quickly contacted the service staff at the TV station.
Get me the manager. Then get me somebody who can pull a commercial, stat.
But to Jimmy's surprise, there were still 9 more scheduled airings according to the contract. Jimmy owed them $4,000, and there was no option for a refund or resale. He asked Kim to find loopholes in the contract, but Kim, already overwhelmed with the Mesa Verde Bank case, said she didn't have time to look into it, since Jimmy had temporarily lost his job. It also meant he had no income. Kim suggested they could fire their assistant Francesca because she could handle filing documents or making coffee herself. However, Jimmy didn't want to fire Francesca. He thought she was flexible and worked well with him. Even in Breaking Bad, Saul continued to employ Francesca. Jimmy promised Kim that even if he was out of work, he would find a way to cover half of the firm's expenses. He said he could consider closing the firm only if he truly couldn't come up with the money someday. Seeing Jimmy's determination, Kim didn't insist further. Next, Jimmy started thinking of ways to resolve the TV ad issue. He approached a carpet store owner, Pop, to pitch his ad business. Jimmy said that for just $4,900, he could produce 9 ads for free and air them during prime time on a popular radio station. Pop thought it sounded good, but when Jimmy asked when Pop wanted to place the order, Pop said he needed to wait until next week. Hearing this, Jimmy wasn't pleased. He suggested that Pop should shoot the ad now and complete it by 3:20 p.m. Jimmy didn't want to miss out on today's advertising opportunity. Pop thought that producing an ad in such a short time would result in poor quality. Jimmy assured him he had a complete editing, splicing, and color correction process, but Pop still didn't believe Jimmy's promise. Ultimately, Jimmy's attempt was unsuccessful. With just 2 hours left before his ad slot, Jimmy would lose $400 if he didn't find another ad to fill the space. Usually quick-witted, Jimmy suddenly felt at a loss. Finding a paying client to shoot an ad and getting it broadcast on TV in such a short time seemed like an impossible task. At this moment, the makeup girl behind him had an idea.
Maybe you could make a commercial.
Have you not been listening? That's what I've been trying. Oh, right.
She successfully reminded Jimmy that he could shoot a recruitment ad to fill the slot himself. Jimmy hurriedly drove to the TV station's lot, knowing that filming the ad there and communicating on-site would be the most efficient. However, considering he had previously appeared in ads as a lawyer, it would be a conflict for him to now appear in a recruitment ad. So, Jimmy decided to write a script and have the makeup girl help. Jimmy asked the makeup girl to do a test read of the script, but he felt she lacked conviction.
For a limited time, we'll shoot your commercial today and have it on air tomorrow.
I thought you were like president of the drama club or something?
I'm treasurer.
Next, Jimmy asked the sound guy to read it, but he couldn't deliver the lines smoothly either. One look at the cameraman's appearance, and Jimmy decided he was a definite no-go. After some thought, Jimmy decided to do it himself, knowing he was naturally suited for it. Jimmy's ad turned out to be as explosive as ever. That evening, he received calls from several clients wanting him to shoot ads. Kim was very curious about how Jimmy managed to drum up business again. Jimmy recounted the day's events in detail to Kim. Learning that Jimmy could produce such an effective ad on the fly, Kim couldn't wait to see the original footage. Jimmy felt the ad wasn't that great and didn't want to show Kim, but under Kim's persistent persuasion, Jimmy finally played the ad.
What's that I see? Albuquerque's next TV star? It's you, small business owner, struggling to make it in today's fast-paced economy? Look at you. You're a triple threat. Great services, great products, and most of all, that face. You're a star. Wrap it all up in your natural charisma and bam, you belong on TV. Better watch out for autograph hounds and paparazzi. And it gets better. I can have you on the air tomorrow. You heard me right. Tomorrow. Better get ready to be famous, Albuquerque. I can make you a TV star for a price you can afford. Call me, Saul Goodman. The world needs to know about you and your business. Call me now.
Kim was stunned after watching it. She discovered that Jimmy had given himself a new name, Saul Goodman.
Saul Goodman.
At that moment, Jimmy didn't think much of the name, not realizing it would become an indelible part of his identity for the rest of his life. The reason the Breaking Bad series is considered a classic is not only because of the outstanding performances by the main characters but also because every supporting character is vividly portrayed. This has led many viewers to continue watching for the sake of the supporting cast. In Breaking Bad, Saul appeared as a supporting character, and his humorous performance was loved by the audience. The director decided to write a prequel to Breaking Bad with Saul as the main character. Thus, the first season of Better Call Saul began airing in 2015, and the final season concluded in 2022. The average rating for the entire series has surpassed that of its predecessor, Breaking Bad. Of course, the supporting characters in this spin-off are also quite remarkable. Do you think the writers might choose another character from this series to create another hit? Today, we will focus on the main supporting characters of this show. In previous episodes, Gus and Mike worked together to disrupt Hector's secret transportation route, which directly caused a significant decline in Hector's operations. Additionally, due to Hector's arrogant nature, the boss Don began favoring Gus's transportation route. This sparked Hector's jealousy towards Gus, prompting him to force Gus to help him transport goods. Hector thought he had succeeded, not realizing he was stepping into Gus's trap. One day, Hector sent his subordinate Nacho to collect the contraband provided by the boss with Gus's men. Don provided 11 packages in total, 5 for Hector and 6 for Gus. This showed that Don valued Gus more than Hector, but Nacho took 6 packs of the contraband. Seeing the deadlock, Tyrus had to report to his boss, Gus. Gus told Tyrus to give Nacho the package. He didn't care about the minor loss. At that time, Gus was inspecting a factory up for sale, secretly planning to build his commercial empire. The place he was inspecting was the laundromat where Walter worked in Breaking Bad, and the one introducing it was Lydia, a female executive from the German company Madrigal. In Breaking Bad, Lydia was also an important character. The plan to hijack the methylamine by the Walter, Jesse, and Mike team was her idea. From the 3rd season onwards, Better Call Saul started intertwining with the plot and characters of Breaking Bad, making the show increasingly exciting. Most viewers of Better Call Saul have watched Breaking Bad. After completing his task, Nacho reported back to Hector. Hector was very curious about Gus's reaction and felt smug, thinking he might have scared Gus. This clearly showed that Hector's intelligence was not on the same level as Gus's, which destined him to end up as a loser before Gus. Hector called Nacho not just to get a work report from him, but because he had something important to tell Nacho. He found out that Nacho's father, Manuel, runs an auto upholstery shop and gets his supplies from Mexico. Hector planned to use Manuel's supply route as a cover for his own business. Hearing this, Nacho, who had always followed orders, gently refused his boss for the first time. He didn't want his family involved in this industry. Moreover, his father was honest and upright, and he would never comply with Hector's arrangements. Nacho wanted to continue making excuses to refuse, but Hector had already made his decision, leaving Nacho no choice. At that moment, Arturo reported that Tuco had caused trouble again in prison. Hearing this, Hector's blood pressure soared, triggering his chronic heart condition. He hurriedly pulled out his medicine, but accidentally dropped a pill. Seeing this, Nacho quickly got up, pretending to help Hector, but actually hiding the capsule under his foot. He was starting to plan to kill Hector to protect his father. After taking his medicine and calming down, Hector directly ordered Nacho to persuade his father. After Hector left, Nacho looked at his life-saving capsule and then went to Price's house. Given their previous unpleasant collaboration, Price thought Nacho was there to extort him again. Nacho straightforwardly asked Price if he could get such capsules. Price hesitated for a moment and said he could. Nacho offered a price Price couldn't refuse, $20,000 for a few empty capsule shells. To ensure a safe transaction, Price approached Mike, hoping he would continue being his bodyguard. But Mike, not needing money and wanting to avoid trouble, flatly refused Price's request. When Price mentioned his trading partner was Nacho, Mike stopped and asked what Nacho wanted to buy. Price said it was an empty capsule that looked like heart medication, and Nacho had paid him a lot of money. Mike suggested Price find an excuse to cancel the deal. Price, thinking Mike was dissatisfied with the payment, immediately raised the offer to $3,000. Seeing that this idiot still didn't get his point, Mike angrily turned and left.
But not interested.
Lately, Mike had been attending community support group meetings with his daughter-in-law, where he heard a neighbor share the story of her missing husband. This reminded Mike of the innocent civilian who died because he robbed Hector's truck. and he imagined his family was also worried about him. Although Mike had secretly punished Hector, it hadn't brought him peace. To find the body Hector had buried, he decided to get useful information from Nacho, so Mike contacted Price and agreed to be his bodyguard. Mike's purpose was to engage with Nacho because Mike had previously tried to kill Hector but was secretly monitored by Gus. Mike guessed that Nacho was buying the drug from Price to kill Hector, so he kindly warned Nacho not to do it. Based on his experience of being monitored by Gus, Mike opened Nacho's gas tank to check for a tracker before he was reassured. When he learned that Nacho was doing this for his father, Mike advised Nacho that if he succeeded and didn't get shot in the head, he should quickly switch the pills back to avoid detection. Before the deal, Mike asked Nacho for the location where they had buried the civilian's body. The next day, Mike went to the US-Mexico border based on Nacho's information. He used a metal detector to search the area and, after half a day's effort, finally found the burial site. Then Mike made an anonymous call to the police, providing them with the specific location of the buried body. Mike felt better when he thought that the innocent man could be reunited with his family. With the capsules in hand, Nacho started making fake pills at home. Afterward, he kept practicing slipping the pills into his pocket to ensure everything would go smoothly because failure would be catastrophic. At night, Nacho sabotages the air conditioning in the snack bar where they regularly collect their money. The next day, as expected, Hector took off his jacket because it was too hot and hung it on a chair. After collecting the money, Nacho pretended a bill might be counterfeit, prompting Hector to ask him to bring it over. Nacho took the opportunity to reach into Hector's jacket pocket, but unfortunately, the pill bottle wasn't in that pocket. After Hector confirmed the bill was fine, he handed it back to Nacho. To reach the other pocket, Nacho pretended to clumsily spill the money on the floor, apologizing profusely to Hector. While picking up the money, Nacho finally managed to stealthily grab the pill bottle. When no one was around, Nacho secretly swapped the pills. The sweltering weather masked the cold sweat that had broken out all over him. When he's done changing the pills, Nacho gets up and pretends to get Hector a cup of coffee. With Hector's approval, Nacho had one crucial step left: to return the pill bottle to Hector's pocket. Fortunately, after countless practices at home, Nacho perfectly slipped the pill bottle back into Hector's pocket. Once Hector was dead, no one would bother his father again. Meanwhile, Mike took out the money he had stolen from Hector. Looking at the piles of cash on the table, Mike knew that he could never earn that much money as a security guard. He needed to launder the money before he could use it, so he thought of Gus. Since Mike had a history with the Salamancas, if they found out about his cooperation with Gus, there would be serious repercussions. Mike suggested a paper transaction, but the cautious Gus still felt uneasy. Gus came up with a good solution, saying he could waive Mike's commission to solve his problem. Previously, Gus had considered hiring Mike, and their handshake this time marked the official start of their collaboration.
Salamanca did! Salamanca money! Salamanca blood!
You have to calm down.
That hacienda, I pay for it! And you treat us like dogs!
Hector, this isn't personal.
It is! It is personal!
Hector was so emotionally agitated that he suddenly had a heart attack. He hurriedly grabbed the life-saving capsules from his pocket. Little did he know that his subordinate Nacho had switched out the medication. Thus, the always arrogant and overbearing Hector collapsed to the ground. Hector was so agitated because Don, in pursuit of immediate gains, had sidelined him, a senior member, and instead favored the newcomer Gus. Seeing this, Gus quickly ordered his men to call for an ambulance and instructed his superior one to leave the scene. Then he began performing CPR on Hector. Gus thought that if Hector died just like that, it would be too easy for him, as he had not yet avenged his good brother. Nacho picked up the scattered capsules and put them back in his pocket because Mike had reminded him to switch the capsules back. Otherwise his actions would be exposed. When the doctor arrived on the scene, he indeed asked Nacho for Hector's emergency capsules. Although Nacho had done everything seamlessly, he still couldn't escape Gus's scrutiny. Taking advantage of Gus being on the phone, Nacho noticed a gap in the sewer ahead and staggered forward, preparing to throw the capsules he had switched out into the sewer. However, just as Nacho was about to make his move, Gus called out to him. Seeing Gus walking towards him, Nacho hurriedly shoved the pill bottle back into his pocket. The bottle of pills was like a ticking time bomb in Nacho's pocket. Arriving at Gus's warehouse, Nacho couldn't find an opportunity to dispose of the pills, and it was obvious how nervous he was. Juan called Nacho and Arturo over. He knew Arturo but not Nacho. Fortunately, colleague Arturo vouched for Nacho, so Juan didn't suspect anything. He stated that although Hector's recovery time was uncertain, their business needed to continue as usual. After giving instructions, Juan let Nacho and Arturo leave. Nacho drove to a bridge, intending to destroy the evidence that could cost him his life. But Nacho never imagined that his every move was under Gus's surveillance. To launder the money he had stolen, Mike took the initiative to approach Gus for cooperation. Gus also appreciated Mike's talent. For safety, he arranged for Mike to work at the German Madrigal company, with Lydia being the contact person. This was also their first meeting, since Better Call Gus is a prequel to Breaking Bad. This is why Lydia appeared so familiar with Mike in Breaking Bad. For his safety, Mike asked Lydia for the detailed money laundering process. Lydia explained that around $10,000 would be transferred weekly to Mike's account in the form of a salary, and it would take about 20 weeks to complete. Additionally, insurance, income tax, and other extra fees were covered by Gus. Lydia assigned Mike the position of logistics consultant, but Mike said he wasn't good at that. He asked Lydia if he could change to being a security consultant, as he used to be a cop. Lydia respected Mike's choice. Mike asked if the rest of Gus's crew operated the same way, but Lydia said this was her first time doing this. She didn't know who Mike was, but the shrewd Lydia knew Gus must think highly of him. Seeing how much Gus valued him, Mike let go of his doubts and handed his real documents to Lydia. Looking at Lydia's excellent working environment, Mike said he was taking a big risk for drug dealer Gus.
If that's all you think he is, then you don't know Gustavo Fring.
At the same time, Jimmy, who had lost his job, started thinking of various ways to save money and increase income so he could continue sharing rent with Kim. Because Jimmy shot a recruitment ad, he got an order the next day. Under Jimmy's professional guidance, the sofa store owner made the most amazing ad ever. Jimmy suggested he strike while the iron was hot and shoot a few more ads. But no matter how much Jimmy pitched, the sofa store owner only had the budget for one ad. After a whole day of work, they earned a total of $545. When it came time to split the money, Jimmy gave the 3 college students $1 each.
This is money I've already spent on airtime for that commercial. $445. You know what that leaves me with?
$100.
$104.95 for writing, directing, producing, client outreach, sales, transpo, all of it.
I get it. Obviously, the 3 of them together couldn't outtalk Jimmy alone. That night, Jimmy and Kim tallied up their expenses, which totaled over $3,000 for the month. Jimmy needed to cover half of the costs. He not only scraped together his share but also had a bit left over to order takeout and treat Kim to a meal.
Hey, hi.
$24.
Keep the change.
$1.
Yeah. We can make it 0.
The next day, Kim went to Mesa Verde Bank to handle business. Paige felt immensely satisfied when she heard that Chuck made a fool of himself in court. Chuck's arrogance in snatching the case had previously left Paige feeling disgusted. Moreover, Chuck had once scolded Paige for getting an address wrong. However, Kim seemed to feel a bit guilty and did not share in the joy. Seeing that she had a disagreement with Paige over the matter, Kim started working with a heavy heart. However, she quickly realized she shouldn't act this way. She apologized to Paige and then opened up about her feelings.
No, I'm sorry. There's no excuse for talking to you like that. As far as I'm concerned, all we did was tear down a sick man.
Meanwhile, after finishing community service, Jimmy was the first to jump out of the car because he had to rush to shoot an ad for a client. With no time to wash his face, Jimmy made do with wet wipes while the small crew got into position. Jimmy raced against time. They hurriedly stuffed all the equipment into the trunk of Jimmy's Suzuki, and then they scrambled to get in the car. However, after all their effort to get in, the beat-up Suzuki refused to start. After several attempts, they ultimately decided to take the bus. This time, they were shooting an ad for the guitar shop owner, but to their surprise, the guys backed out again because the price was too high. Jimmy began to use his specialty, but no matter how he persuaded, the owner refused to shoot the ad. Helpless, Jimmy had to cut the price in half. But even with such a big discount, the guitar shop owner was still not satisfied. Not wanting the trip to be wasted, Jimmy made a bold decision. He agreed to shoot the adverts for them for free, but if the adverts were good they would need to shoot the rest at the original price. With the proposal laid out, the owner agreed to Jimmy's plan. Although they didn't make money this time, the employees still needed to be paid. Jimmy had confidence in his ads and thought he'd make a big profit next time. The next day, Jimmy's team returned to the guitar shop. As usual, Jimmy's ad was highly effective. and the owner said it was the busiest day since they opened. According to their verbal agreement, Jimmy was ready to shoot 7 more ads at a discounted price of $7,000, but the two men changed their minds again, saying they had consulted with the TV station and found out the price for one airing was just over $400. Jimmy explained that was just the airing price and did not include the cost of shooting the ad. In Jimmy's opinion, his creativity belongs to the payment of knowledge, but the guitar shop owners clearly didn't see it that way. They said they could continue using the ad they already shot and could settle the airing fees directly with the TV station. Jimmy stated that the ad's copyright belonged to Saul Goodman's company and couldn't be aired without his permission. The owners got angry, saying Jimmy just hired a few college kids and they could find people to shoot the ad for much cheaper. They then told Jimmy and his team to leave. What they didn't know was that they had angered Slip and Jimmy. Jimmy glanced at a set of drumsticks nearby and immediately had an idea. He went to the cameraman and had him turn the camera on him, and then Jimmy got the drumsticks on the floor when no one was looking. He then asked the owner again if they wanted to shoot the ad. The owner, annoyed, said, "Can't you see I'm dealing with customers?" Jimmy apologized and wished them good business. Then Jimmy performed a very professional fake.
Are you okay?
It was a drumstick. It was laying loose in the aisle.
Somebody call an ambulance!
No, you don't need to. I don't need. Oh, yes, an ambulance. That's a good idea. You guys have liability insurance, right?
Meanwhile, Kim was at a restaurant meeting with Kevin from Mesa Verde Bank to report on her work. Coincidentally, Howard also arrived at the restaurant to meet with a client. Kim wanted to avoid Howard, but he eventually noticed her. Since Kim and Jimmy had embarrassed Chuck in court and disgraced the HHM firm, Howard came over to say hello, but actually wanted to be sarcastic with Kim.
Seems like just yesterday she was logging hours in doc review. Always a pleasure to see one of our proteges spread her wings and leave the nest. Well, I'll get out of your hair. Best of luck to all of you.
You too, Howard.
Hearing Howard's words, the strong-willed Kim couldn't swallow her pride. When Kim resigned from HHM, Howard agreed that she wouldn't need to repay the law school tuition that HHM had funded. Seeing Howard's attitude, Kim immediately wrote a check to repay the tuition to Howard.
Marie Austin, good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
After Kim saw off her client, Howard quickly came up to question her. He accused Kim of being ungrateful and stabbing HHM in the back. Then, in front of Kim, Howard tore up the check, wanting to make her carry this burden indefinitely. But Kim didn't show any weakness. She said that she and Jimmy were only presenting the truth of the matter. As for you, Howard, to hide the truth from your clients, that's your own business. Howard was left speechless and could only watch Kim leave. When Kim returned to the office, she saw Jimmy lying on the floor playing the guitar. Jimmy didn't tell Kim the truth. He only said the guitar was something he earned from shooting an ad, and that he had accidentally slipped while filming. But that wasn't the main point. Jimmy asked Kim to take the money on the table, which covered his share of the rent for the next 6 weeks. Kim suggested that Jimmy didn't have to push himself so hard and that she could cover all the expenses for now, saying she could support both of them, but Jimmy refused Kim's offer, insisting he could manage on his own. Meanwhile, after being persuaded by Howard, Chuck proactively contacted a doctor to get a treatment plan. Chuck even tried to handle shopping for daily necessities on his own, deliberately diverting his attention and avoiding places with electrical devices. When Chuck returned home, he found Howard waiting at the door. This time, Howard came to talk about Chuck's professional liability insurance. Just a few days earlier, Jimmy, to save on expenses, decided to temporarily cancel his professional liability insurance for a year. After all, he wouldn't be practicing law that year, so there was no need to waste money on it. However, the staff gave various reasons for not refunding the premium. Worse, the staff mentioned that because Jimmy's license was suspended for a year, the premium would increase significantly next year. Hearing that the premium would increase by 150%, Jimmy immediately launched into his superior acting performance. He pretended to be deeply saddened and painful, bringing up the feud between him and his brother Chuck. He said Chuck had mental health issues and had broken down in court, which could be verified in court records, because Chuck's professional liability insurance was also with this company. Jimmy ended by saying he didn't mean to bring it up and hoped they wouldn't increase Chuck's premium. After the performance, Jimmy immediately stopped crying and, as he left, reminded them not to trouble HHM law firm. Jimmy did this out of spite for Chuck. His premiums went up. He can't make it easy on Chuck. Soon, Howard received a notice from the insurance company about the increased premium for Chuck, but Jimmy didn't realize that his small act would cause a butterfly effect.
And Slippin' Jimmy I can handle just fine, but Slippin' Jimmy with a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun. The law is sacred.
What kind of character makes the audience hate him so much that they wish for his swift demise, even to the point where some viewers curse outright? This also demonstrates that the director has done an excellent job in shaping this character. Chuck is exactly such a person. Although he is highly respected in the legal world and is a standout in the industry, his jealousy has distorted his entire being. This ultimately leads to a bitter fallout between the brothers, with mutual destruction being their inevitable fate. Because Jimmy was suspended by the Bar Association for a year, his insurance premium for the next year has increased significantly. To balance his emotions, Jimmy deliberately revealed Chuck's condition and his behavior in court. Soon, the insurance company arrived at HHM Law Firm to notify them of the premium increase, which affected all the firm's lawyers, doubling their insurance costs. Even more dramatically, Chuck's upcoming work had to be supervised by a partner at all times. Hearing this, Chuck angrily ended the conversation.
The insurance industry is heavily regulated. I can think of a dozen infractions right here off the top of my head.
Mr. McGill.
You're hoping we'll either find another carrier or cut you an enormous check. Win-win for you. I assure you, neither is going to happen. What will happen is very simple. You're going to do right by us, or we will compel you to do so.
What do you mean by compel?
You know exactly what I mean.
If you're threatening litigation, I'm afraid this meeting is over.
Then it's over.
After the insurance company's staff left, Howard considerately turned off the lights for Chuck, then brought a glass of wine to have a heartfelt chat. Howard mentioned knowing a retired lawyer who teaches at a university, who would be delighted to have Chuck help with teaching. Howard's implication was clear. Chuck could retire early, which was a heavy blow for Chuck. Howard always prioritized the firm's interests above all. Chuck thought Howard was concerned about his health, so he quickly turned on the lights to prove himself.
Howard, I'm fine!
This is not what fine looks like. I can't be partners with someone whose judgment I don't trust.
Realizing that further discussion was pointless, Chuck left without looking back. Meanwhile, to check on the progress of the Sandpiper Crossing case, Jimmy brought Irene's favorite cookies to visit her. After a few probing questions, Jimmy learned that the case would take several more years, meaning his commission would also be delayed by several years. Although the commission would be a substantial income, it couldn't solve Jimmy's immediate financial crisis. Trusting Jimmy, Irene handed over all the documents related to the case to him. Just as Jimmy was thinking of ways to guide Irene to expedite the case, Irene's friends suddenly invited her to join them for a workout. Seeing familiar faces, they warmly invited Jimmy to join as well. But at this critical moment, Jimmy had no time for exercise, so he politely declined with a casual excuse. After leaving Sandpiper Crossing, Jimmy calculated that he could get over $1 million in commission, which instantly filled him with joy. To expedite the case, Jimmy confronted Howard, accusing them of dragging their feet, which was detrimental to the client's interests. Howard, not being naive, saw through Jimmy's urgency to get his payout and humiliated him harshly.
All you care about is your share of the payout. It's like talking to Gollum. You're transparent and pathetic. You want a handout? Here. Next time, why don't you bring a tin cup?
Since Jimmy and Kim had humiliated Chuck in court, tarnishing HHM's reputation, Howard viewed Jimmy as an enemy. Jimmy's subsequent actions confirmed Howard's suspicions. Jimmy began pushing the case forward in his own way, pretending to work out and running into Irene at the mall. After spouting a lot of nonsense, Jimmy showed off his new shoes to Irene and asked if she liked them. They were obviously high-end sneakers for seniors, and it was impossible not to like them. Jimmy said he bought a pair for his girlfriend, but they didn't fit and the store wouldn't take them back. He asked for Irene's shoe size, but no matter what she said, Jimmy had the right size because he had bought every size. They fit Irene perfectly, and she was thrilled, but she insisted she couldn't take them for free. Jimmy mentioned he did need a small favor. He asked her not to tell anyone that the shoes were from him, or they would feel left out. Irene promised to keep it a secret. With everything set, Jimmy began to deliberately sow discord between Irene and her friends.
And the truth is, if Irene settles, you'd get some money. But I mean, it's not like you guys need it, right? On the other hand, I did get a look at their offer. I don't want to speak out of school, but it's, but I mean, hey, everyone's situation is different. Maybe Irene just doesn't need the money. I mean, I don't know for a fact, but when you see someone buying nice new things...
Like those shoes.
Like those shoes.
Uh-huh.
After Jimmy's provocations, Irene was soon isolated by her sisters. In a game orchestrated by Jimmy, he deliberately ensured that Irene won in a bingo game, but not a single person applauded for her. Poor Irene couldn't hold back her tears and left in distress. Cunning Jimmy pretended to comfort her, and Irene confided her frustrations to him. This gave Jimmy the perfect opportunity to bring up the Sandpiper Crossing case. Jimmy pretended to guess that maybe they wanted to get the settlement money as soon as possible to improve their lives, and that you as a representative should consider their needs. After all his efforts, Jimmy finally achieved his goal. Meanwhile, through Kevin from Mesa Verde Bank, Kim met a new client. The oil tycoon had been embroiled in a border dispute over his oil drilling and had sought help from several lawyers to no avail. However, during her first visit, Kim resolved the boss's problem, making her confident about securing this major case. After the client left, Kim quickly recorded her strategy ideas on a voice memo, but as she prepared to leave, her car got stuck in the sand. In such situations, most drivers would call the just departed client for help, but the independent Kim insisted on solving it herself. She would never trouble someone else for something she could do alone, but her solo efforts were limited, and her car nearly hit the fence. After an all-night effort, Kim organized all the materials for the new case by early the next morning. Just as she was rushing to defend the case, Jimmy arrived with a bottle of rare sapphire gin, wanting to celebrate with Kim, but Kim was too busy to pay him any attention. Jimmy mentioned that he was about to receive his payout from the Sandpiper Crossing case, surprising Kim since the case hadn't been settled yet. Jimmy told her not to worry about those details. He also feels that his behavior is not acceptable, but no matter what, the money is coming soon. Isn't it worth celebrating? Despite Jimmy's insistence, the already late Kim didn't have time to raise a glass. Reluctantly, Jimmy shared his triumph with his assistant Francesca. On her way, Kim continuously rehearsed her defense speech for the client. Kim is so focused on getting her first win on a new case that she forgets she's still driving. Fortunately, Kim didn't lose her life in the accident, but unfortunately, the case she had prepared overnight would be delayed. Rushing to the scene, Jimmy was heartbroken to see Kim, but their understanding was unspoken. That evening, Jimmy took Kim back to the accident site, picking up the scattered materials. After all, it was the result of Kim's all-night effort. After this ordeal, Jimmy realized that the main reason for Kim's accident was the immense pressure and her relentless drive. Kim pushed herself so hard to ensure their firm's survival. In order to ease Kim's burden, Jimmy decided to sublet the firm, and was going to fire Francesca. This clearly showed how important Kim was to Jimmy. On the other hand, Howard received a letter from Chuck. He thought it was Chuck's resignation letter, so he arranged his secretary to prepare a grand farewell ceremony. However, Howard was infuriated when he read the contents of the letter.
God damn it, Chuck. You're suing Hamlin McGill.
To prove that he was healthy, Chuck had turned on every appliance in his house. Howard scolded Chuck for his selfish behavior, but Chuck reminded him that he was a founding partner of the firm and had mentored Howard through his bar exam. If Howard wanted him gone, he would have to pay. Chuck knew that HHM couldn't afford his buyout fee at the moment. After Howard left, the deceitful Chuck couldn't hold back any longer. Turns out it was all an act he put on for Howard, but Howard wouldn't let Chuck get away with it. And the next day the firm held a shareholders meeting to settle Chuck's affairs. Because Chuck has turned his job as a lawyer into his whole life, he can't accept that he lost his job. Chuck thought his plan had succeeded, and he declared that if no one objected, they could act like nothing happened, and he would forgive and forget. Reconciling with everyone, Howard asked the other partners to leave the conference room temporarily. Then he took a check out of his pocket and handed it to Chuck. He preferred to pay out of his own pocket to fire Chuck, because Howard knew Chuck wasn't putting the firm's interests first but only cared about his own. In the end, Chuck left the firm he had built with everyone bidding him farewell.
Everybody, thank you for gathering. I have some bittersweet news to share. I'm sorry to say, but our fearless leader, Charles McGill, will be leaving HHM, effective immediately. I want to take this moment to thank Chuck for everything he's done for HHM. We started off with 6 employees, and Chuck helped grow us into one of the largest firms in the state. We will be forever grateful for his dedication. Do you have anything you want to say? All right then. Let's give him a hand.
Meanwhile, the injured Kim still hadn't forgotten about work. Francesca said Kim was lucky because she often saw people die in accidents at that intersection. Francesca's casual remark made Kim reassess her life. Realizing that nothing else mattered compared to being alive, Kim canceled her meeting with the oil tycoon client and asked Francesca to accompany her in buying a lot of DVDs. She decided to relax at home for a while. Affected by this life and death incident, Jimmy also began to worry about his brother Chuck. Although Jimmy felt conflicted, he mustered up the courage to knock on Chuck's door. When Jimmy arrived at Chuck's house, he saw that all the electrical appliances were working normally. Jimmy felt happy for Chuck. Out of familial love, Jimmy wanted to reconcile with Chuck and repent for his actions. However, Chuck was cold, as he had just lost his beloved job and blamed Jimmy for it. Chuck pointed out all of Jimmy's flaws and said there was no need to reconcile because Jimmy had never been that important to him. This was like a sword piercing Jimmy's heart. He fell silent and prepared to leave. At the door, Jimmy wanted to say something more to Chuck, but seeing Chuck's cold demeanor, he left heartbroken. This blow undoubtedly had a profound impact on Jimmy. Next, Jimmy went to Irene to inquire about the Sandpiper Crossing settlement, but to his surprise, the settlement money had not yet arrived. Because Irene had not yet reconciled with her friends, Jimmy approached the others to try to make amends for his mistakes, but a broken mirror cannot be easily restored. As Chuck had said, Jimmy hurts those around him, and now it was difficult for him to repair the damaged relationships. When the gloomy Jimmy returned home, Kim immediately saw that he had hit a wall. Jimmy complains to Kim about his confusion, but complaining wouldn't solve anything, so they decided to relax and watch their favorite movie. Just then, a spark of inspiration struck Jimmy's mind with a solution to the problem, though it required sacrificing his own image. Early the next morning, Jimmy went to the Sandpiper Crossing nursing home. Under the guise of a substitute instructor, he led the elderly residents in their morning exercises. At that moment, Irene, Jimmy's former colleague from DM law firm, showed up. She was currently handling the Sandpiper Crossing case. Pretending it was urgent, Irene demanded to talk to Jimmy immediately, which was all part of Jimmy's prearranged script. Jimmy had Irene lead him into admitting that he had manipulated Irene's relationships with her friends, and he purposely left the microphone on. Their conversation was clearly heard by the old people. After the performance, Jimmy returned to the room and pretended to forget to turn off the microphone, making his act even more convincing to the elderly residents. Jimmy paid a hefty price to make amends for his wrongdoings. After all this, Jimmy and Kim's WM law firm is declared broken and their only employee, Francesca, is fired. Jimmy apologized and promised that if he opened another law firm, he would call her first. He kept his promise, as Francesca remained his assistant throughout Breaking Bad. As they left, Jimmy and Kim were a bit sad to leave. After all, this was their first law firm.
We'll get another.
A better wall.
Meanwhile, after Jimmy left, Chuck's symptoms began to relapse. He turned off all the switches in the electrical box, but even lying in bed, he still couldn't sleep. The next day, Chuck discovered that the electric meter was still running even though he wasn't using any electricity. Calling for a repair would take 2 days. To find the source of the electrical use, Chuck removed all the light bulbs, but the meter kept running. Because Chuck now felt like he had nothing, he tried to get his life together and go back to work, but it didn't work out that way. All these reasons drove Chuck to the edge. He went crazy searching for the source of the electricity leak, punching holes in perfectly good walls, not sparing even the tiled ones, and even dismantling the bookshelf. Finally, Chuck found a hidden wire inside the wall, but when he went out to check the meter again, it was still running. This broke Chuck completely. He took a baseball bat and smashed the meter. Ultimately, feeling utterly hopeless, Chuck chose to end his life in solitude at home. Looking back on Chuck's life, he had achieved class transitions through his own efforts, which gave him a sense of achievement and at the same time made him a bit arrogant and conceited. Coupled with intense jealousy, Chuck was destined for an unhappy life. If one cannot recognize and correct their own flaws in time, tragedy is inevitable. Better Call Saul Season 3 ends with Chuck's departure. The upcoming Season 4 promises to be even more exciting. Fans, be sure to like and follow so you don't miss any of the thrilling plot.